Hello, today's video is about using Git as a diff viewer program like Diff or DiffMerge. For example, to compare two versions of the same file in the Git repository or to compare two distinct versions of a file on a file system. We would also configure Vim as a Git diff tool and explore third-party plugin Vim Git Gutter to work with diff hunks without Vim entering a diff mode. Okay, let's go. First, let's quickly prepare a sandbox environment for our demo. Here I have my .files project with a lot of uncommitted changes. For example, let's pick the .c file and extract two versions of it from Git into separate files, working tree version and one from the Git index. Special notation is used here to refer blobs in the Git index. Now let's dump both files to the screen using bat command for colored output. We can use fzf to quickly look up the file using double-star completion sequence, as we discussed in our previous episode of Vim Universe. So now we have opened two files side by side, both having changes and different number of lines, as you can see. By the way, this might look like a Vim, but that's just two separate MOOCs windows. There are two ways to enter diff mode. First is running a new dedicated Vim instance with files specified on a command line. Run vim-d or vimdiff, which are pretty similar. Terminate the command with two or more files to compare. Note how we select multiple files at once using fzf. Also, let's start with a clean Vim configuration and suppress my Vimrc for a moment. Okay, it works and Vim shows two files in a diff mode. However, it looks so awful and unreadable with stock configuration. So let's start with some minimal sane Vimrc configuration. Here is one I've prepared for the demo. Some general purpose settings, shortcuts to jump to normal mode, leader key setup, and Dark Dracula theme. Let's try it once again. Yeah, that's look much better for sure. Second way to enter diff mode is to reuse existing Vim instance. Probably you already have one when working on a project. Open two files side by side and run diffthis command for both windows. You might navigate each window one by one and repeat diffthis command, or you can run it once using window diffthis. Vim will switch those buffers in a diff mode. Toggle back in normal mode, run diffoff command in both windows, and close one of the windows you don't need anymore. Same to diffthis, you can use window diffoff, or even simpler diffoff plus bank to affect all windows in a current tab. Instead of manually creating a new split, opening a file to compare and running diffthis command, use diffsplit command, which combines those steps for you. Notice how it opened a horizontal split, since we haven't yet configured it to prefer a vertical one. So, there are two methods of entering diff mode. Vim-d is best used for one-shot comparisons triggered from a command line, like when using Vim as a Git diff tool. Use the second approach when you are already inside Vim and don't want to jump back to the command line and spawn new Vim instance just to compare two files. With latter method, you can also compare unnamed in-memory only buffers, which don't have any backing file yet. For example, copy two snippets of text in individual buffers and compare them without even saving files. As opposite, Vim-d approach works only with files on a file system. Vim has a default setting. Let's take a closer look. First, it makes sense to use vertical splits when viewing diffs. Next, we have a block of new lines on the left. Since there are no visual glues at the opposite side, it's hard to tell the exact position where lines are added or removed. Let's fix it by using virtual filler lines. To catch up with our changes in Vimrc, we have to reload Vim. Now the correlation between diff hunks is much easier. Also, despite that files have a different number of physical lines, the scroll position is now properly kept in sync. Each diff hunk is surrounded with a number of unchanged lines called context lines. Seems like it's 5 lines by default. Let's say we want only 3 lines for better focus on change code only. With vertical splits, window width is usually quite limited, especially on laptops. It makes sense to hide or reduce non-important screen elements. For example, we have 3 columns reserved for line numbers, which is quite fine, and 2 columns for the gutter with plus fold symbol, which can be reduced. We can inspect and change our settings on the fly. No effect so far. When in doubt, turning something off and back on is the best solution. Great, now it's only one symbol reserved for the fold column. Toggle it back to feel the difference. So far we've talked about presentational aspects only. Now let's talk about library that performs diff calculation and generates patch. Starting from Vim version 8, it uses the same xdiff library as used by Git. So Vim and Git share the very same set of options when it comes to diff calculation. In the git config man page, we can find 2 options worth looking at: diff algorithm and indent heuristics. The recommended configuration is to use Patience algorithm to generate patches and opt for indentation heuristics. I would recommend reading this article for details: The Power of Diff at vimways.org. In short, it explains the difference between default and Patience algorithm. The indentation heuristics is about shifting diff hunk boundaries to make patches stand out and be easier to read. Let's change our Vimrc. We would extend diff opt setting with new values. By the way, it turns out that I already have the very same options in my git config file. When I compared diff generation in Vim versus DiffMerge utility, I found one limitation. Vim is unable to do word diffs, nor it can find moved and modified lines. For example, given this file, let's move one line by inserting new lines around it. Toggle the diff mode. Good, see how it detects the moved line properly. Now let's amend that line by appending few words. Toggle the diff mode once again and check out the results. Vim stops seeing similarity between those lines and doesn't arrange them visually on one line. Now let's compare it with the output from DiffMerge tool. Apparently, the DiffMerge has more advanced algorithm. Personally, I've been using DiffMerge for years and I'm pretty satisfied with it. Now I'm experimenting with Vim as a diff tool, but keep DiffMerge as a fallback solution to switch over when Vim shortcomings become too critical. Next thing that distracts me much is the collision between file syntax highlighting and diff hunks coloring. It's looked like a child's painting full of random colors. Let's turn syntax highlighting off for a moment. Much better, it's easier to focus on diff hunks only. Now it's time to make this configuration persistent in our Vimrc. It's possible to detect whether given buffer is in the diff mode right now by adding condition like this. It makes sense to disable spell checking as well. Let's check out the results. Great. However, it has quite a big limitation. This method works only when Vim is launched in the diff mode from the beginning, because condition we added in the Vimrc is evaluated at the startup. As opposite, when you use diffthis or diffsplit commands from the running Vim instance, it doesn't work. What you need is some sort of event to detect when buffer enters and exits diff mode. Vim has a bunch of so-called auto commands to catch various events, things like when buffer is read or written to a file and so on. However, it doesn't provide anything to detect diff mode mutation. Personally, I use such workaround by hooking into winEnter and buffEnter events and checking for diff mode asynchronously after a small delay. Let's copy relevant code snippets from my production Vimrc. First, auto command group. Next, some auxiliary functions, where I'm turning syntax highlighting and spell checking on and off, depending on buffer's diff mode respectively. Final piece is an extra utility function to set Vim option globally or at a buffer or window scope. Yes, it's a bit ugly and complicated code, but you don't need to understand all that stuff. It's okay to just copy and paste such polyfill things. I will share our test Vimrc config by the end of this video. Now, let's check our results. Personally, I can hardly imagine using Vim as a diff tool without this tweak. Going further with diff coloring, there is an extra tweak I'd like to introduce. I don't like this background highlighting for change code. I would rather opt for foreground text color instead. Let's go to our Vimrc and change it. There are several highlight groups related to the diff mode. Particularly, we are interested in diff change and diff text groups. When you use custom theme like Dracula in my case, those highlight groups are usually linked to the groups exported from the theme. Let's disable coloring for changed lines as a whole. Since groups are linked to the Dracula theme, we would unlink them as well. Then set custom color just for changed text, rather than a whole line. However, it's not sufficient to leave this snippet as is. It should be evaluated right after the custom theme is applied. There is a Vim's built-in color scheme auto command available for that purpose. Now, let's check out the results. Personally, I like it more. Compare both configurations. Now, let's configure Vim as a Git diff tool. In the git config file, add diff section with a tool property set to Vim diff. That's it. Let's test it. Here is a directory with a Git repository having some changes. Now run git difftool command. It works well, but Vim diff runs in a read-only mode. It makes it impossible to make small changes on the fly. To change it, create a dedicated difftool section. Don't use Vim diff, but type complete Vim command with proper arguments to run in a diff mode. If you are using some other program to compare diffs, like DiffMerge or kdiff3, It makes sense to keep both tools at your fingers. Console-based ones such as Vim and GUI-based like DiffMerge or Visual Studio Code. For example, I have several sections for different diff viewers, but currently using Vim and DiffMerge only. Let's test our configuration. To invoke GUI diff viewer, use -G flag. You might have noticed how I'm using QAll command to close all windows at once. Regular quiet command would close only one window. However, when running Vim as a git diff tool with two windows side by side, I'm meant to close both as they constitute a whole thing, and move on to the next changed file. Personally, I don't type quiet manually each time, but have a keyboard shortcut for such a common action. Moreover, you can create smart quiet window function, which goes beyond simply closing the current window. For example, if Vim is launched as a diff tool, it makes sense to close both windows right away. Recall how we initialized isStarted as vimdiff variable earlier. Now, whenever I have a couple of changed files, I'm only a single keyboard shortcut away from closing DiffViewer and moving on to the next one. To navigate through diff hunks, use built-in shortcuts. In my Vimrc, I have conditional mapping for up and down arrow keys for that purpose, since I'm not using them for navigation anyway. Notice how we augment default big key behavior when buffer is in a diff mode. Useful trick is to recenter screen after each jump. So far we've talked about features when Vim is in a diff mode only, but wouldn't it be great to view, navigate or manage diff hunks whenever you are working with a file in a normal mode? Meet the plugin called Vim Gutter. Let's quickly install it and check out its features. See how sign column on the left side contains various symbols for added, removed or modified lines, making it easier to track your changes. It keeps in sync as you edit the buffer. But notice how long it takes to propagate the change. It's around 4 seconds by default. For me, the latency is too big, but it's possible to make it more responsive via update time setting. Okay, it's much better now. Next, you can navigate between hunks using the very same shortcuts as you get used to in a diff mode. Another super useful feature is folding all unchanged text and showing only modified lines. Use it to quickly review your changes in the middle of your work or before making a commit. Also, plugin provides a dedicated text object representing an individual hunk. In Vim as a language philosophy, one can compose a sentence by combining verbs like select, remove, yank to operate on text objects aka nouns like paragraph, sentence, or a diff hunk in our case. Now it's possible to visually select a whole hunk or delete it in a single keychord. How about undoing a single hunk in a working tree, overwriting it with a version from git index? If you are using Vim airline in lieu of default status line, Vim git getter integrates well with it. Here is how it looks like with my production Vimrc. It shows the total count of added, removed and modified lines. So that's it for today. As you can see, with some tweaks and tricks, it's perfectly okay to turn Vim into yet another diff viewer tool. But recall that patch generation and diff calculation algorithm cannot compete with specialized tools like DiffMerge. For example, it cannot detect move and modified lines properly, so it makes sense to keep both at your hands. Plugin like Vim git getter is really useful and makes possible to work with diff hunks even when Vim is not in a diff mode. Unfortunately, tweaking Vim configuration for your personal needs is always a tedious and laborious process. It is not a plug-and-play solution and has a steep learning curve. To make it a bit easier, you can find a link to our test Vimrc file created during this demo in the description under the video. But I strongly recommend you to spend some time learning what's going on inside before pulling it as is. There is also a link to my production Vimrc file for those who are curious. Thank you for watching this video. Bye!